also a BSS. We're going to be tag teaming this presentation today. And before we begin, as always, just a really deep feeling of gratitude to you all for the work you're doing with your students to support the teachers at your school sites and for taking time out of your packed schedule to connect with us. We appreciate your willingness to be here. All right, so let's jump in. Growing your own mental flexibility. Today's agenda is pretty simple. We're going to begin with a little bit of reflection and a check-in before looking at teacher burnout, professional burnout, and how mental flexibility can be a tool to combat those feelings of burnout. We're going to give you some practical applications and tools, and then send you on your way to enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. So as a way to create a little bit of community, a little bit of positivity at the beginning of our session, we're going to invite you to participate in a chat waterfall. So just put this into the chat and we'll just kind of watch the responses pour in. We would like to encourage you to share something that is filling your cup this month, something that's bringing you joy. Daily workouts, music and walks. Newborn nephew, exercise, yoga, vaccine rollout, our families, Starbucks from your principal. Spring is coming, sunshine, I know that warmth. Wonderful. Getting small groups of kids to come back, walks with the dogs. Wonderful, thank you. Thank you for sharing. So now, as our next steps, we're going to kind of do a reverse order from the way we typically do this. And we're going to invite you for a moment of reflection, a moment of pause before we begin rolling out the content. So Molly has created this wonderful collection of questionnaires that are designed for personal reflection. The link to the questionnaire is in the chat. It's going to prompt you to make a copy. And when you make a copy, when you open that up, you're going to see sort of a landing page that has directions to those questionnaires and then 3 different questionnaire tools. And we're going to invite you to spend about 6 minutes engaging in that first tool, the acceptance and action questionnaire. And as you jump into that questionnaire, there are questions at the top and then a little space for reflection at the bottom. And so this time we are going to give to you to just kind of look inward. This won't be shared. This is just for your own personal well-being, personal reflection. And just take about 6 minutes to fill out that acceptance and action questionnaire. If you'd like to begin exploring the other ones, you're welcome to. But I'll stop talking and I'll give you a little bit of time to just look inward. And if you're just now joining us, we're jumping into that acceptance and action questionnaire. We're starting off our time together with a little bit of self-reflection. So you can click on the reflection questionnaire, go down to the acceptance and action tool, and use a little bit of, or take a little bit of time to reflect. take about 1 more minute. Just as you find yourself at a stopping point, we'll come back together. Thank you for taking that time. Sometimes it can be hard to kind of slow down and just look inward, especially at the end of a long day. This questionnaire was, well, it's designed for multiple purposes, but this one, this first attempt at filling it out is really just kind of some baseline data. And then as we talk about some of the tools that we're going to introduce today, you might find it beneficial to go back in a couple of weeks and see if your scores have changed at all. So as we begin this conversation today, thinking about the context of why we're here, I know that many of us really feel that weight of kind of the early spring slog. I always feel that February and the beginning of March seem heavier to me. My feet feel a little bit heavier. It feels harder to get through lesson plans, get through the day. And I also know on top of that, right, with the stress of the profession currently, we are also seeing increased levels of burnout, regardless of what month of the year it is, right? So we're going to be introducing this idea of mental flexibility or psychological flexibility as a tool to combat this burnout we're feeling and or sort of that spring slog. So what is burnout? And in this sense, we're thinking about kind of professional burnout for teachers. So burnout is really comprised of three main considerations. Excuse me. The first being emotional exhaustion. So this feeling of just being emotionally overextended and depleted. I personally can tell that I am emotionally exhausted when really small inconveniences feel like huge mountains, or if I'm feeling like I'm kind of on the verge of tears all day. That's an indicator to me that I'm emotionally depleted. The second consideration is depersonalization. So that's the feeling of just sort of feeling negative or callous or maybe detached from either a situation or people, being perhaps our coworkers, friends, family, students, that feeling of detachment. And then thirdly, this lack of personal accomplishment. And this can mean feeling sort of incompetent and or maybe experiencing a lack of achievement or success. This one is very real for some of us currently, as we feel like so many of us feel like first year teachers all over again this year. And we may not be experiencing success in the same way that we were in the physical setting. Now, this is not to say we aren't still experiencing great success in our classroom, but we recognize that it might feel a little bit different. So all of these considerations contribute to this idea of professional burnout.
So then we come to the idea of what is mental flexibility. Now, in the more formalized field of the study of psychology and in counseling and therapy settings, this is referred to as psychological therapy or psychological flexibility. And it's which is essentially like this range of skills that are tied to your resilience. So resilient individuals tend to have these psychological flexibility skills in hand so that they maintain that resiliency moving forward. Many consider these to be the cornerstone of mental health. So those many therapists and researchers agree that to have a strong mental health foundation, psychological flexibility is a part of that. Now, we're using the term mental flexibility here because we're not in that formal clinical setting. We're here among our peers, and I feel that the change in terminology is appropriate for that context. Now, the formal definition around psychological flexibility is essentially living and acting in accordance with personal goals and values, um, in the presence of those potentially interfering thoughts and feelings, but with a greater appreciation of what their current situation or context allows. And in other words, it's the ability to handle your intrusive thoughts, feelings, and emotions that are triggered by environmental stress, so that we can live more fully in this moment, in the current place that we're in, and cope with stress more effectively. So these are the tools that we can draw upon to deal with stress. And now, what I mean when I say intrusive thoughts and feelings, those can be anything from those negative thoughts about ourselves that pop up when we make a mistake, for example, like tripping on my words. Something might come up in my mind and say, "Oh, you're always making mistakes." That's an intrusive thought. In certain situations, you may have intrusive memories even. I know that for me personally, because this is a safe space, I know I can share this. Recently, I had to make an emergency trip down to El Paso to help my family. And on the way there, I was on a packed airplane, fully packed. And a trauma response was triggered because I was stuck between two people with close contact to their shoulders. I was on the verge of panic. And because of my work around this area, I was able to draw back and handle myself mostly. But that's an example of an intrusive thought, an intrusive memory occurred in that case. But this can also be intrusive habits, old habits that you have tried to kick in the past and maybe conquered currently, but in stressful situation, your mind says, but this thing, you could do this thing. Such as smoking or other things like that. For me, I know overeating is a massive one in that kind of a scenario. And so these are the kinds of things that I mean when I say intrusive. They're old habits, old memories, things like that. Ella, I see you with that ice cream, girl. I'm lactose intolerant, but I will reach for that ice cream every time if it's there. And so mental flexibility and psychological flexibility are the tools that we can draw upon to handle this. And essentially, I really love this quote from Dax Peltzon Roche of it's the process of developing tolerance and acceptance for challenging experiences, allowing them to gently pass and maintaining a broader perspective in the midst of them. I found that to be a really beautiful summary of the process of mental flexibility. And if we're considering it in that way, then we can also kind of reframe that acceptance and action questionnaire towards our understanding of this now. You took that questionnaire without really knowing a lot of what we were going to see. And now that we have this definition and this understanding, we can go back to that questionnaire later on when you're ready to fill it out again and think about it in some different terms. And I hope that you do.
And as thinking about mental flexibility, we're going to be talking about processes of mental flexibility. So there's a recent study that came out that's actually linked to the bottom of this slide. This was conducted in Italy. And this study looked at the mental health implications associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically mental health as it pertains to lockdown, right? Not being able to see our friends and family, not being able to engage in our work in the same way, as well as those heightened fears around personal safety and safety of loved ones. And in this study, they identified that, of course, significant percentages of the population reported mild to severe paratraumatic stress or distress, meaning like the emotional and psychological distress that occurs in the midst of a traumatic event. And we know that this pandemic has been a traumatic event for all of us to some degree. So I'm sure, of course, many of us can probably relate to the participants in this study that just reported a significant increase of feelings of stress, anxiety, depression, isolation, grief, insomnia, etc. And in this study, they found that mental flexibility or psychological flexibility was identified as a really viable psychological resource to help mitigate or at least moderate the mental health impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic specifically. So mental flexibility is fostered by 6 therapeutic processes: diffusion, acceptance, present moment awareness, self as context, values, and committed action. And we'll go into these in more detail in a moment. You might be familiar with some of these terms if your school has adopted the AIM SEL curriculum, because AIM is built on acceptance commitment therapy, which is intertwined with this idea of mental flexibility. So these might be familiar to you if your school uses that curriculum. So going back to this study, the study demonstrated that participants that had higher mental health risk factors during COVID-19 lockdown, and also higher levels of mental flexibility, so strengths in these 6 areas, reported better overall mental health during the pandemic. So even though their risk factors were relatively high, with the ability to strengthen this mental flexibility, some of that stress, some of that anxiety and depression was moderated or mitigated. So we're going to describe all 6 of these processes in detail, but we're really going to focus on 3 of them: self as context, diffusion, and values, because this particular study also found that these were the 3 processes that had the greatest impact overall on mental health during prolonged period of stress or prolonged stress scenarios, such as the COVID-19 lockdown. So we'll go over these first 3 relatively quickly. Acceptance, right? This idea that we're acknowledging and accepting the emotions that we're experiencing any given moment fully, but also allowing those emotions and thoughts to come and go rather than struggling with them or kind of hanging on to them. Present moment awareness. So we think back to the work we've done around mindfulness or grounding activities and just maintaining that focus on the present moment. And committed action. This is the idea of setting goals that align with our values and following through with those goals. So these 3 are incredibly important, but we're really going to do most of our work on the next 3. So self as context. This is the idea that people are not their feelings or thoughts, but rather our conscious minds are experiencing feelings or thoughts. So this is the ability to really observe yourself and your thoughts, recognizing that I am not those thoughts, right? Especially with those thoughts that interfere or disrupt what we need to be focused on in the moment, right? I am not that negative or unproductive thought. I'm simply having that thought. And then if we look down at diffusion, now this is really connected to that self as context. Diffusion is the idea of releasing the connection to negative thoughts, patterns, images, memories, or urges, and observing these negative patterns non-judgmentally, which decreases the connection to that thought over time. So I've been wrestling with these 2 and kind of how to describe them. And the best I can come up with, because they are kind of complicated, is the idea of Velcro. So if you think of like 2 Velcro strips, and this first Velcro strip on the right, this is us, like our core authentic self. And this other Velcro strip is our thoughts or our experiences in the moment. And sometimes that Velcro is fused together, right? So that it's hard to tell where our self ends and those negative thoughts or intrusive thoughts begin, right? Because we're so enmeshed in them. We are fused to those thoughts. But as we work on diffusion and as we work on self as context, we can kind of like peel this Velcro away and begin to notice those thoughts in context. Observe those thoughts non-judgmentally and recognize that that's just a thought I'm having. That is not who I am at my core. And then I'm better able to decide what to do with that thought. Right, exactly. Reactive versus being. Thank you, Elakari. That's well said. So it takes practice, right? This sort of Velcro thing that we're working on. I hope that image helped you. That I feel like was the best I could come up with. But I think it's what I'm going to stick with. And of course, values. We talked about this at length in our last PD, values being the elements in your life that are most important to you, the things that make you feel whole and most like your authentic selves. And sometimes I find that kind of like looking at the inverse of these definitions helps me to understand the definitions even better. So of course, the inverse or the opposite of mental flexibility, thinking of this as mental inflexibility, is when someone engages in experiential avoidance or sort of lack of present moment awareness. Self is content or fusion to thoughts, right? When that Velcro is all the way pushed together. Lack of content with values, inaction, and impulsivity. So we're going to start to dive into this application and practical tools that we can use to begin to kind of grow this mental flexibility and strengthen it, just like we would our muscles or our body. And we're going to focus again on these three areas: self as context, diffusion, and values. So we're going to begin with this idea of self as context, or the processee is self of context, and the tool is this idea of recalibrating our monitor. So this came from this really wonderful book called Burnout that I highly recommend. There's a link to the bottom slide there that'll link you to the publisher if you're interested in looking at this book further. And in the book, the authors describe what they call our internal monitor. So in psychological terms, this monitor is really the discrepancy reducing or discrepancy increasing feedback loop. But that doesn't really roll off the tongue, and monitor is a little easier to use. So this monitor that each of us has at any given moment knows the goal we are currently working towards, how much effort we're investing in that goal, and how much progress we're making toward that goal. So in this particular book, it explains this idea of driving to the mall, right? So when our monitor is happy when the amount of effort we're putting into a goal results in sort of equivalent progress towards the goal. The monitor is quiet. So if I leave my house, and from my house to Coronado Mall, it's about 15 minutes, and I get in my car, and I don't really hit any traffic, and I get to the mall, I pick up what I was going to get, and I go home. My monitor is going to be kind of relatively quiet, right? Because I just did what I expected to do. However, this monitor notices that when we're not making progress towards this goal, it gets upset, right? And tells us that we should be upset. And typically we sort of oblige, right? We get frustrated. So I like to think of this in that going to the mall scenario. Maybe I'm driving from my house. I'm halfway down Manal and there's construction and it's down to one lane. And I'm just sitting in traffic, and what should have taken me 15 minutes is now taking me 25 minutes, and I'm not even all the way to the mall yet, right? So I'm putting in a lot of effort towards this goal and really not making any progress. So my monitor is upset, right? And this happens when we are fused to this thought, when we are self as content in this moment. But we can practice self as context by recalibrating this monitor. And that can happen through this process called positive reappraisal. So in this moment, if I'm in my car and I'm feeling frustrated, I'm feeling hot, and I can't get my jacket off and it's one lane of traffic and I'm just not having a great time, I can take a moment and work through this positive reappraisal or this recalibration. And during that time, I'm going to name the discomfort I'm feeling. So I'm going to name that I'm frustrated because I feel like my time is being wasted. And I get frustrated when I'm sitting in traffic and I'm not getting something done. That's my discomfort. And then I'm going to name the opportunity. So the opportunity is actually getting to the mall because I know Banana Republic is having a sale and I really want to go buy something that will make me happy. And in that moment, after I've named the discomfort and the opportunity, I can decide if the opportunity is still worth it, right? And if it is, I can tell myself that I may experience this discomfort, but I will get through it and the opportunity will be worth it. And I like this idea of recalibrating the monitor because I think sometimes I feel like it might get confused with this idea that like the glass is half full or look at the bright side or look for the silver lining. And there's a component of that, right, in looking for the opportunity. But it also gives us some time to acknowledge, what are my emotions? What is the challenge or the discomfort that I'm feeling right now? Because it's helpful and healthy to acknowledge that discomfort. So on this next slide, we're going to invite you to practice this recalibrating of the monitor. And we're going to ask you to think to yourself about a current stressor or a potential stressor in your life, and take some time to name the discomfort that you may feel while dealing with this stressor. It can be personal or professional. And then we're going to ask you to name the opportunity that may accompany this stressor. And if you find that that it's worth it, right, to continue through this discomfort to move toward the opportunity, then we're going to invite you to maybe write an affirmation to enforce that the opportunity is worth the discomfort. We'll give you about 4 minutes for this. You're welcome to just sort of self-reflect, or you're welcome to put this in the chat if you feel comfortable. It's up to you. We'll give you some time to practice. Thank you for taking this time to reflect. I appreciate you all. I appreciate those of you that were willing to put it into the chat. I think this can be a really great tool. It takes a lot of practice to use, but maybe this can be something that can mitigate some of the stress we feel throughout the day.
And so this next tool is pretty similar to Anna's. It kind of draws upon some similar lines because it's about taking are engaging with our impulses, our feelings, and our emotions, and seeing them in that new way. So while Anna's is really aimed towards, let's focus ourselves towards this opportunity, reframing here is going to be taking our thoughts and putting essentially a new frame around them so that we can make it safer for us to interact with it in a productive way. It redefines that intrusive thought's meaning so that you can maintain your sense of self outside of that thought. And so remember, as we're continuing with this, the process of self-context is essentially remembering that my thoughts are not me. I am not my thoughts. I am experiencing my thoughts. And in this way, we have greater control. And that's really what this framing activity helps us to do. So in framing, we are literally taking those statements, those memories, and those impulses that our brain is sending us that we are experiencing, and giving them a new sentence stem around it. We're giving it a new statement to replace it with intentionally. Now, those of you who have been in previous sessions with us, such as, oh, goodness, my brain just went blank. I had this all scripted out and ready to go, and then my brain went blank. In past sessions, we discussed something similar with setting boundaries. That's what it was, with setting boundaries, where we took those negative belief statements and we practiced thinking about them in new terms. This is really similar to that, and that's part of why it is effective for boundary setting. It's because it draws upon self as context. So, for example, the simple statement of "everyone hates me." I know I'm the kind of person that I stick my foot in my mouth pretty frequently, and so this is a thought that when I see reactions on others' faces pops up for me quite frequently. I'll see a reaction or I'll hear a response and think, "Uh-oh, this is true of me." But in reality, if I stop, when I feel that intrusive thought, when I hear that voice in my head, I can stop and say, I'm feeling disconnected from others. That brings up my insecurities. Now, that reframing is a little bit lengthier of a thought. And part of the thing about that is that we're challenging our brain here, right? So we need to be very clear and intentional with our reframing. So I'm taking that thought of "everyone hates me" and I'm reframing it to be aimed more towards of what I am feeling rather than my perception of others. I'm detaching myself from that, and I'm detaching myself from that feeling, and I restate it as, instead, this is what I'm feeling. And by naming it, I'm removing it from my sense of self, and I'm instead reflecting on my thinking process. So this is really a metacognitive skill of reframing our own thoughts. So another one, my students are struggling, I'm a failure. In this case, I feel like my professionalism is tied to student success. I can't control my student grades, but I can control what I'm teaching and how I'm teaching it. Now, that reframing not only allows me to be metacognitive around my thinking and my brain, but it also allows me to take action. Now I'm not just controlled by my thoughts anymore. My thoughts aren't driving my bus. I am driving my bus, and I'm able to direct it where I would like to. Now, this is something that you can also do with impulses. For example, if I get that impulse to go and smoke a cigarette, it happens every once in a while, and when it happens, I know that this is an impulse I'm going to have to deal with. So I can reframe that impulse when I feel it, when I get that urge, when I feel that need. I can just instead say to myself and work towards this. In moments of stress, my brain will try to reach for easy coping strategies, even if they're unhealthy. I have new ways of dealing with stress, and I can make a choice that is healthy for me. Now, again, this is not easy. This is a big statement to replace it with, and it takes practice. But I'm facing that impulse. Instead of allowing that impulse to drive my decisions, I'm aware and I'm acting on a metacognitive strategy of facing that impulse head on and recognizing that it is not a part of who I am. And the same thing happens with unwanted memories. As I've said before, these unwanted memories pop up. Those of us that have dealt with traumatic events, or any of us who have intrusive memories from our past, our students deal with this as well. This can be a way for us to help work around this, to detach ourselves from it. My mind is still processing what happened in the past. So no, I'm referencing my feelings, things I'm feeling, things my brain is doing, and my mind. That's how I'm recalling and separating myself from that aspect. My mind is still processing what happened in the past, but I am living in the present, and I can choose how that memory impacts me. And that's a literally true statement. Literally, I cannot live in the future or past. My physical self is here. My brain might try to do something else, but I am the one that can choose how memories impact me. And that offers, again, a sense of control. Now, something that I'd like you to do, you can put this in the chat again if you'd like to, or keep it to yourself because sometimes this is hard. Think about one of those intrusive thoughts, impulses, or memories that you deal with, because we all do, whether it's something that we're fully conscious of or not. And I want you to consider how you can reframe that so that you are recognizing that you are separate from that thought, memory, or impulse, and what you can do about it. So see if you can practice that for yourself. I'll give you just a moment to see if you can work on that idea a little bit, because it's a challenge, but it's something to definitely puzzle with. So think of that memory, think of that unwanted thought or intrusive thing, and then what you can replace it with. And if any of you are struggling with this as well, you could also consider, if you've done work around boundaries since our boundary setting session, these can also be considered the things that kind of keep you from setting boundaries, those thoughts and feelings that prevent you from setting boundaries or allow those boundaries to be pushed over. These are the same kinds of things. All right, I'll go ahead and move on. And it can bring us some more diffusion.
Awesome. Thank you, Molly. Oh, that was a rookie mistake. I couldn't unmute. Has to happen at least once a meeting. So now as we're thinking about diffusion, right? So we're thinking about unhooking ourselves from those intrusive thoughts. Again, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of connection between a lot of these tools. And one tool to use with diffusion is mindfulness. Now, I'm just going to go over this briefly because I know we've done a lot of work around mindfulness here in our time together in the last couple sessions. But just to reiterate briefly, that mindfulness can serve as a really powerful vehicle to identify unhelpful thoughts and label those thoughts as just thoughts, right? We're noticing those thoughts, noticing that our brain is thinking them rather than getting caught up in them, right? And looking at thoughts rather than from thoughts. Right? Looking as if our Velcro pieces are separated and looking at each other instead of fused together. And so in the sense of time, we're not going to go through one of these guided mindfulness sessions, but there are 2 links at the bottom that I encourage you to explore. They're guided mindfulness sessions specifically focused on diffusion and this idea of noticing thoughts and letting them go. There's a really beautiful one. That first one uses this imagery of sand, like our thought is written in sand, and then some wind comes and part of that thought gets blown away, and gradually more of that thought gets blown away. So some really beautiful imagery that you might consider working into your mindfulness practice to unhook from those unhelpful thoughts and let them go.
And then this strategy is one for diffusion that I find to be particularly helpful for those more difficult thoughts and moments and feelings. The container strategy is a strategy that allows you to kind of formalize the idea that you're struggling with and clarify it, and then decide whether or not you are ready to face it and deal with it in that moment. If you're not, and if you're feeling as though this is something that is too big for you to take a bite of in that moment, then you can simply put it away. And this visualization strategy helps you to put that away safely so that you can deal with it later on your own terms. So this begins with a really simple visualization of creating an image of for yourself of a container that you feel comfortable interacting with. In my past working with strategies like this, I've used a bank lockbox because it feels very secure, especially for those really tough to deal with things. I know my sister, she practices this as well. She uses a really pretty box with like moons and stars all over it because she's a hippie living in San Francisco. What else would she do? But the container is something that is based around something that you would like to reach for. It's something that is appealing to you, either in its security or its visual nature. And that way, when you're in these moments of stress, you know that you can go there and you feel safe and comfortable doing so. So then once you have your container in place, what your lockbox, your pretty moon box, whatever it might be, then you move on to thinking about your thoughts. So we're going to back to metacognition, and we are observing our thought and the feelings it brings up for you. And oftentimes we'll find that that thought is connected to a lot of other things. So maybe this thought about me feeling really insecure right now is actually connected to 3 or 4 other things in my brain. And it's also bringing up a memory back here. And it's also bringing up this other thing. And I'm feeling this in my chest. And all of these things are connected purposefully because we feel emotions in our body. Stress lives in our body. And so we observe all of these things and where we're feeling it. And we visualize that as well. We pack it up. And then we put that in the container. We take all of that stuff and we pack it into that container. Once it's there, you can decide how you feel about it. Oftentimes, when we visualize removing these things from ourselves and we formalize their thought in that way, we feel perhaps more ready to deal with it, to take it apart and to handle what we're doing, what we're dealing with in that moment. Other times we do need to put it away because we're not in a space where we can do it. Like that example earlier with my trauma response. I used a container strategy to handle that trauma response because in that moment on the airplane, surrounded by people, stuffy, I'm wearing a mask and I'm stressed out, I wasn't in a space where I could deal. So this container strategy was a space where I could put those thoughts away and then handle them when I felt safe. And that's the key for this diffusion, is that you are recognizing that that's still there. It's still present in your body, it's still present in your mind, but you're allowing yourself to not connect with it fully in this moment. You are unhooking yourself with the realization that you can kind of look at it again when you're ready. You can hook back on if you need to. You can get in contact with it again, but it's on your terms and in your control. So quickly in the chat, because we are running out of time, I do want to take 1 minute and think to yourself, if you were to use this strategy, what does your box look like? What does your container look like? Is it a fishbowl? Is it a shoebox? Is it a box that you are repurposing from your old iPhone that for some reason you've held onto this box for forever and ever and it's sitting in your closet for no reason, but you're deciding to keep it, so now you might as well use it for your visualization. What is your container? Visualize what you think it would look like and what would you reach for, and then pop it in the chat. I love cookie jars. That's a great one. A blue cardboard box with a lid. I love the specificity. Glitter box. Oh, the thonk sound, Anna. Yes, the thunk. Ooh, a coffin. No, that's not too dark at all. I love the macabre. Love it. Beautiful. Thank you guys for sharing that. I hope that you find that those are things that you can connect to moving forward. Marble jar, love it. And so last, before we kind of wrap this whole thing up, we do have a piece on reflecting on values. Now, defining your values is an important piece in this whole puzzle of mental and psychological flexibility, because it's essentially the foundation on which all of this is built on. That's part of why it's such a core piece in that research that we cited earlier around COVID-19, is that if we have our values, then we know where we need to place our focus and where we can reach. If we don't know our values, then we're lost. It's harder to build up these other aspects of mental flexibility. So the questionnaire that I popped in the chat earlier and that you worked on before also has a questionnaire around values. What it asks you to do is to pick out areas of where values can live that you find that you're essentially attached to. So there's values of everything from like religion to family to kids, all of these different things, art and expression, and you kind of rank those or decide how strongly tied you are to those as values that you hold dear. And then on the flip side of that, you are going to rank how closely you are living towards those values. How well are you focusing yourself toward those values that you hold dear? For example, one of mine that I always put high is artistic expression. I hold artistic expression as a very high value of mine. But in times of stress, especially, I find that I do not live anywhere near in alignment with that value. It falls away quickly. And so this is a great reflective tool for us, not just in this present moment, but in the future to return to, just like that acceptance questionnaire, to see how well we're living in contact with those values. And in those moments where we find ourselves straying from that value, then we can rein ourselves back in and realign so that we're back in touch with those values. And that way we can rebuild that mental flexibility from there. So I encourage you to take a look at that questionnaire and explore it a bit. See where you live on it, see where you land, and reflect on what that means for you a little. I really think that finding your value spaces can be hard. And I'm glad, Aubrey, that you put that in the chat, that it was helpful for you, because I found it to be really helpful too, especially as teachers, where our identity is teacher, where we are one with our career and our profession. And in a profession that doesn't prioritize mental health, in a profession that doesn't prioritize your time as a person, our values fall away quickly. So it's important to do this reflection, and I'm glad, Aubrey, that you found some value there. And so as we're wrapping up as well, I know that you explored all of these things, but you threw a lot at you. I would really love, and I know Anna would really love as well, we're going to do another chat waterfall. And as you're comfortable, I'd like you to take a moment to share what this experience was like for you. Were certain questions on these questionnaires more difficult than others? Were certain ideas more challenging than others? Go ahead and pop in the chat as you feel comfortable and reflect on that, on this experience that we've had together. Joan, I see your comment, and I can see why that might be difficult. It's sometimes hard to perform these visualizations. And I'm going to be super duper honest about that myself. I struggle with mindfulness with ADHD. So visualizations, mindfulness, meditation are all really difficult for me, partially because of ADHD. And so I find that we got to be understanding that different mental spaces make it easier or harder to access some of these tools. And I think that's part of why we wanted to try to give multiple means for each of them. So I hope that the other option was something easier to access for you, because I understand that feeling for sure. Awesome. And so I accidentally kind of did both of these. So one last thing to consider, and for this aspect, you can unmute and talk as a group, or you can pop it in the chat. My big question is, what are your next steps for integrating this information? And some of you started popping that in already, but I wanted to make sure to ask it explicitly and offer the open talking space as well. So what are your next steps for integrating this wealth of information into your work on yourself? Prioritizing time, yeah, and finding time and space. I think that's oftentimes the most challenging thing, is just creating space for yourself. And that's part of why we like to provide super explicit tools at times, because sometimes it's easier to make the space if you have something concrete. Awesome. I'm really glad that you're liking the questionnaires. That was something I was pretty nervous about. So I'm really glad you're liking them. Put many hours of work into those. And you will find, before I totally shut off, there is one more questionnaire in there that we didn't go over today. And it's a questionnaire called COPE. Now, on that specific questionnaire, it is an inventory of your coping strategies, essentially. It's, what do you reach for in moments of stress? When things are rough, when life is difficult, what do you reach for? And what it does is it asks you, of course, a ranking. These are all ranking assessments. And how often you use those. There's a lot of questions on there, 52 questions, which is quite a bit to handle. But the cool thing about it is that it tells you what areas of coping tendencies you tend to reach for most frequently. If you are problem focused, emotion focused, or avoidance focused. And there's nothing right or wrong about any means of coping, except for how it makes you feel and how you respond to it. Each of us has our own means of coping with stress. And so what this does is it helps to give us a really explicit way to frame our coping mechanisms in a way that helps you to understand what's working for you and what isn't. So it's a really fun tool for that. And I highly recommend exploring it. I know 52 questions sounds like a lot. You actually go through it pretty quickly. And that's part of why we didn't include it in our time together today, because I was like, oh no, that just seems overwhelming. So I really, really hope that you spend the time with that. And of course, as always, Anna and I are always open and excited to continue this conversation. So you can reach out to Anna through her email, mine through mine, or of course to our whole BSS team. You can also reach us through social media. We are on Twitter and we are on YouTube, and you can find us at BSS Team on YouTube or at APS BSS Team on Twitter. And as everyone else has popped in the plug, please make sure you take a moment to fill out the PowerSchool surveys. They give us a lot of really, really, really great information, and they're always incredibly valuable. And before you go, remember that in April, we're doing some amazing Coaching for Equity workshops with Bright Morning that I know Anna and I are super pumped about. I think they're going to be amazing. So these are a great thing to prioritize as you're planning for the April Summit. And I highly encourage you all to attend those sessions. And as always, I so deeply appreciate all of you for coming and spending your time with us. This has been a lovely way to spend the afternoon. And if you have any questions, we'll stick around for a few more moments. But otherwise, you are free to go and enjoy the rest of your day, hopefully with some time for self-care. So have a great one, everyone.